U.S. government has imposed various export controls on semiconductor companies. In general, how do you think these policies would affect the industry as a whole?
The U.S. government, by using these export controls on semiconductors, primarily, of course, not just semiconductors, but primarily semiconductors, sort of began this process of weaponizing the U.S. dominance, U.S. company dominance, both of sort of production of semiconductors and also the semiconductor manufacturing equipment that's used to produce those semiconductors. So the semiconductor piece of the equation has gotten much more complicated in the Trump era and now into the Biden era. It probably contributed to some of the global semiconductor shortages, for example, because as a result of that, other companies in China began to stockpile semiconductors, worried that the same thing could happen to them, and that rippled through the system. And by some accounts, if you talk to industry people, that could have been as much as 15 to 20% of the semiconductor shortage. And now, as we sort of fast forward to the present, there's a lot of debate in the US government about what to do about, in general, sort of semiconductor exports to China and exports of semiconductor manufacturing equipment. So the Biden team, for example, in April, put Phytium, which is another Chinese semiconductor company that makes CPUs, on the entity list. And again, the justification here was support to military modernization. This is another piece of this justification that's been used in a lot of these export control cases and entity list actions, is that the particular entity has a relationship with the Chinese military, the Chinese government, and so that's a justification for putting them on the entity list. So Phytium was a really fascinating example of this whole process, because Phytium, of course, makes CPUs. Those CPUs are used in high-performance computers, which are used to model weapon systems. So the complexity of this sort of argument around semiconductors has really, has undergone, if you look at that whole swath of time, it's been an evolution, I would say, over this last 5-year period, as the political climate and the relationship changed, of course, from the Obama administration to the Trump administration to the Biden administration. And so semiconductors sort of have become drawn inexorably into that. We've called this the U.S.-China tech Cold War, in a sense, this idea that the U.S. And China are sort of competing in these complicated tech sectors, not just semiconductors, but AI, whatever, quantum computing. And I think that the real problem is sort of that the U.S. government hasn't really articulated sort of how it views China's semiconductor industry in general. Where the Chinese companies fall in terms of the sort of global semiconductor supply chain. The semiconductor industry is very global. It's very market driven, right? There's lots of different places that are key. Asia, obviously, China, Taiwan, Japan, Europe is some very important companies in Europe. So it's a very global effort. And China's companies have become very important players in the sector over the last 10 years also. So in terms of things like packaging and testing, in terms of design, for example, and in terms of production, companies like SMIC becoming a good example of a really important player. And so the question within the US government, and that's never really been discussed in any detail, is, okay, well, China and Chinese companies are important players now in the global supply chain. How do you balance these national security concerns, which I've mentioned, with sort of, okay, these companies are important players. They're important customers of U.S. companies, for example. U.S. companies in the semiconductor manufacturing space sell a lot of equipment to Chinese companies that are building semiconductors, for example. And there's a lot of collaboration. So the question is, how do you disentangle all this? And how do you avoid having these export control types of actions, inadvertently disrupt the sector, which is up until then had been, a global sector. There hadn't been a lot of restrictions, lots of movement of capital and people around the world, driven by market demands, some government subsidies in terms of manufacturing, but largely market driven and driven by talent and technology considerations. And so having governments intervene in that in ways that are sort of unknown or have unknown consequences is sort of has been sort of the hallmark of the last 2 or 3 years, as the U.S. has used these its export control powers, as it were, to try to target individual Chinese companies.